I go wherever I want, whenever I want. And where, oh where, is Scheme G? 'Cause I got a scoop for you. When that Ken doll look-alike, when that weatherman wannabe comes out here later tonight, I got a challenge for him, for billionaire Ted, for the Nacho Man, and for anybody else in WCW. Hey, you want to go to war? You want a war? You're going to get one.
Would this technically be, because World War I wasn't World War I, right? It was the Great War until there was another worldwide war, and then it became World War II, and then that actually called it World War I. So this was technically Wrestling World War II, the Wednesday Night War, because the Monday Night War was the first official one, even though the Monday Night War goes back a little bit further.
Yeah.
But that was the first ratings war, and it goes back a little bit further than what everybody remembers, basically NWO and then the 80 something weeks that WCW. But that war, that Monday night is when it finally came to a head, but it really started when NWA at the time decided to put a free Clash of the Champions on TBS to compete with WrestleMania on pay-per-view.
Which WrestleMania was that?
It might have been 4. I think it was 4.
Oh, okay. Wow, that far back.
Yeah, it goes back there, but that was obviously well before the Monday Night Wars. That actually was before Monday Night Raw even existed, because wrestling, WWE had Monday Night locked up for a while. They just had primetime wrestling with Gorilla Monsoon and Bobby Heenan, which was basically just a clip show of matches that they would show from the house show. It's just like, let's go see, Macho Man versus George the Animal Steel at the Boston Gardens.
Right. Isn't it funny that you really didn't realize it was a clip show till way later?
Yeah.
Years later?
Yeah, exactly.
I just always assumed it was all live.
Yeah, exactly. That it was happening, and then they would cut to the studio audience, and then...
Right. I just assumed that this was going on now.
Yeah. It's like you had no idea. But that was... they already had Monday already locked up. But that was when... Once that pay-per-view stuff started popping, and I think it was 4, and they're like, let's just compete for free before we actually go on pay-per-view. To me, that was when it was just like, oh, this is really war. And that was before Ted Turner owned, because it didn't become WCW until Ted Turner bought it.
Right.
He bought out Jim Crockett Promotions, which basically was the main vein of what the National Wrestling Alliance was, because obviously they were a bunch of different promotions, but that was the main one. And it was shooting in Atlanta, that studio show. And then he just basically bought that because he realized that it was getting in wrestling.
Right. And didn't he had a rivalry with Vince, right? That's
because they called that Black Saturday. Do you remember the Black Saturday story? So basically what later was known as WCW Saturday Night was basically just World Championship Wrestling was the name of the show. It wasn't the name of the promotion. And that was basically, everybody knew if you didn't want to watch WWF in the morning, at night, on Saturdays and on Sundays at 5:05, which was cutting back then, like not at 5, it was 5:05.
I remember when the shows were
Yeah.
at 5 after the hour.
Yeah.
Why was that?
I don't know the reason for it. I know later on, when they ended late, it was something to do with ratings. I don't know why the late start.
Yeah.
But anyway, so what happened was when Vince started taking over, the territories, Ted Turner was a TBS, he owned the station, but he didn't own the wrestling yet. And he actually let Vince buy out that time slot. And then Vince basically showed up. Very similar to fast forward into the future when Shane showed up on, Nitro and say, I now own this. It was that equivalent. Just like, wait a minute, that's the WWF announcer, Vince McMahon. Why is he on TBS, where's NWA? And then they basically turned it into like a clip show, like very like what primetime wrestling was. It's just like, let's go to adorable Adrian Adonis and Dick Murdoch in the streets of New York. And then they were just kind of showing that like Adrian Adonis showing Dick Murdoch around the streets of New York and how tough it is. And then they showed like Dr. D, David Schultz, you know, how he was in his house, but like not. And people obviously like, where's NWA? So they were big. That's why it was known as Black Saturday. I don't remember how it ended, but it basically NWA got that time slot back. So and I don't know if that was, to me, that was the first shot of just like of WWE versus WCW. That was way back in late 80s. That was well before the Attitude Era. So the war goes back, it goes deep.
Yeah.
So there was already history there.
Yeah, I didn't realize it went that far.
Yeah, so that's why when they call it just like the Wrestling Wars, is like that was the first, to me, that was anytime that's covered, even in WWE, you know, on the net, you know, Peacock now, that is just like they don't really ever get into. The war started well before that. When Vince started taking over all these territories, you know, Crockett was one of the strong ones because he had like the Ric Flairs and he had all these guys that could carry this.
Yeah, and it was sort of an alternative to WWF at the time. It was not kids wrestling.
No, it wasn't cartoony, and that's
Right.
what like anybody who was a fan of like any other different Southern wrestling, they called WWE cartoon wrestling.
Yeah,
you
and
know?
then they made a cartoon.
And then
out
they
of
had
it.
the Hulk Hogan's Rockin' Wrestling, right?
Yeah.
The Saturday morning cartoon. It's just like that was big. You know, but they were just like, you know, very similar to World Class Championship Wrestling. They were already doing a lot of the stuff, you know, also known as just like more the tough. They had that tough Southern wrestling. So the WWF stuff didn't really play to the, like a lot of people. I think they talked about like they lit up, you know, the switchboard phone at the time of just like, where's my wrestling?
Yeah.
You know, that was on there. So, you know, fast forward, I think it was around 1991 is when actually Ted Turner decided to buy NWA, and he rebranded it WCW. And that's when the story as WWE tells it, when the war started. Because, you know, you have that interview, the famous interview with Vince McMahon talking. He's like, yeah, I got a call from Ted. And he's like, Vince, Ted McMahon, I'm getting in the wrestling business. And then Vince is like, that's great, Ted, but I'm in the entertainment business, you know? So it's just like that. That's when it was bought. And it was a big deal at the time, right? Because Ric Flair was there, and then they started to like try to like, and I think he just bought it to like retain his ratings, you know, and just not like, you know, it's tough to run a wrestling promotion. And having worked for Jim Crockett when he actually bought out Global, and they try to relaunch NWA at the Sportatorium in Dallas, and it just it didn't work. They wouldn't let me. They didn't say, you're no longer Rico Suave, you're Jeff Gretler, and you're going to go out there and you're going to wrestle 30 minutes. You're not going to wrestle 10 minutes. You're not allowed to go off the top rope. You know, they started putting like all these rules to try to make it feel like old school wrestling.
Yeah.
And I can tell you, those matches are different, and they're in a way they're a lot harder. Like that was the first time that I felt like I actually blew up. Like I feel like I always had decent stamina, like you can keep going, but like just like having somebody like holding you, you know, by your neck for like 15 minutes, even if it's not like at full capacity, you're still limiting the amount of oxygen going to your brain. And I remember I actually I just walked to the back, and then I walked right outside, and I just like in my trunks, all sweaty. And I was just like, I think I'm gonna pass out. And I just like sat in the parking lot, and people are just walking by like, and to me, they're just like, oh yeah, he got his ass kicked. We saw him in the parking lot. He couldn't even breathe. And it was true. I was just like, I couldn't catch it. And I was like, literally,
You gave him a great show.
I must have, because it was just like, I was just like, that was the first time I was like, oh man, I'm doomed, because otherwise it was just like, I'm used to like boom, 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 just going. Like you didn't have time to register what it was doing. And I lost that match to Rugged Rod Price with a half Boston Crab. It wasn't even a full one. It was only like one of my legs, but it was enough that I was just like, I tapped. But I was just like, I just remember I was going to pass out. But the problem was, it's just like, it was real enough where it's just like, if you ever watch a real fight, unless it's just like it's two people who don't know how to fight and they're just swinging, you know, UFC is going through this right now. It's boring. You know, it's just like it could be like it's like a chess match, and just like if you have like, you know, that was the whole reason wrestling became a work. It's just like you had the George Hackenschmidt match that lasted over like, you know, an hour and a half because they were too good and nobody was going to beat each other. So it was like, we need to game this a little bit to actually make it entertaining.
Yeah.
Anyway, I'm going off on a tangent, but like, I don't think Crockett was able to keep up with the times. You know, it's just like, and I think that's when he sold to Ted. He actually had an ice cream business that his family ran. He went back to
Jim
that.
Crockett did?
Yeah. So I don't know if it was Crockett ice cream. I don't know, but he went back to that, but then he tried to get back into wrestling. But I think Ted Turner bought it just because I don't know if Crockett could keep up anymore, even though he had all the talent. I mean, he had all the Hall of Famers, you know, the Road Warriors and Ric Flair, Arn Anderson, Dusty Rhodes. Those were all those guys there.
Yeah, WWF was just blowing up though in the mainstream.
Yeah, so they had trouble keeping up.
They
So
had the MTV crossover appeal.
they did the
You
Rock
just
and
can't keep up
Wrestling,
with that.
which, by the way, it's a real slap in the face that Cyndi Lauper is not in the celebrity wing of the Hall of Fame.
Why
even though-
is she not?
I don't know. It's ridiculous because she did give birth to the Rock and Wrestling Connection. Because I
Yeah,
remember
she
watching
was the original Rock and Wrestling Connection.
It's just like, I remember watching, it's just like, wait a minute, was that Captain Lou Albano in a Cyndi Lauper video on MTV? Did you see that? And it's just like, how do you not have her in there? That doesn't make any sense. To me, that's like the biggest celebrity wing slight. That's up there with Bruno Sammartino not being in the main wing for as many years is not having Cyndi Lauper in celebrity, considering she's like the first real mainstream celebrity other than like Muhammad Ali. She was the non-sports person that was actually accepted into the wrestling business.
So why is Ozzy in the Hall of Fame?
So I mean, Ozzy actually has like a storied history. He goes all the way back to like WrestleMania 2. Like he was actually went to the ring with the British Bulldogs, WrestleMania 2,
Yeah.
like way back there. So, and I think after that, you know, Triple H obviously, you know, it's pretty clear if you watch NXT, he has a love affair with heavy metal.
He's a metalhead.
Yeah, he's totally a metalhead. But I mean, as time went on, Ozzy did make a lot of different appearances on there, and he cut a lot, let them use a lot of original songs for pay-per-views.
Okay.
So it did go back there. But again, like he was another one that I can't believe it took that long because I mean, that was WrestleMania 2. That was 1986.
Yeah.
And it's just like, and now it's 2021, and they finally that was a slight. Not as big as slight as Cyndi Lauper.
Yeah.
But it's just like, it was to me, it's a slight. But anyway, we digress. We come back to that. Ted Turner had that small window between like 1991 and 1996-ish, right? It was just like he was still running it.
Yeah.
But wrestling was on that downtime. That's when I was in it. So I think I was holding the business back. That was my time in there. It's just, so you're welcome for the Attitude Era because I left and that's when it picked up again. I was holding it back. I apologize. But anyway, it was just like both, to me, WCW and WWF were struggling at the time. And then if fast forward a little bit, and then Eric Bischoff comes into the picture. And then he's like, wait a minute. It's just like, if you're going to try to compete, even though you're going to try to compete with WWF, you got to stop making it look so Southern and make it so look regional and make it a little more mainstream. And then he got Hogan. And then that's when it started steamrolling. And that's when he's like, let me compete with Vince on Monday nights, which is traditionally WWE night going back all the way to before Raw in the early 90s to WWF primetime wrestling. He owned Monday nights.
Yeah, he owned Monday nights from primetime. But why? What was the WCW show before it went to Monday Live?
There was none.
There was none.
It was
so they launched a completely new show.
Yeah, it was Saturday. They were not on prime time. They were only had their WCW Saturday night was their only show.
Oh, that was their only show. Okay, so I remember at the time because around that period, I was a little disconnected from wrestling. You know, hadn't followed it in a while, and I remember I got pulled back in because of WCW. Because
really,
yeah, because I heard who was it? I think it was when I heard about the NWO. I was like, "Oh, Hogan turned bad. That's crazy."
Oh, wow.
Let me take a look at this. Then I started watching, and like it was like, "Oh, this is cool." Like it was different. It was new. It was like I hadn't seen I hadn't, you think of wrestling, you still remember the rock and roll wrestling 80s. And this just seemed like a very 90s product. And
Absolutely.
I was into it, and I liked all the, Mexican wrestlers they had in there. It was a cool show. Yeah, that pulled me right back in. So,
And understandable. And that's why Eric Bischoff, who also just went in the Hall of Fame, because
Yeah.
it's just like Eric Bischoff was around from the 80s too. Like he was an announcer for AWA, which ran on ESPN at like 3 o'clock in the afternoons, which later Global became like the afternoon wrestling show. But he was one of the announcers. So like I remember, Booker T telling one of the guys, like, because he had just went to WCW, and they're like, hey, who do I talk to up there? Who's running? It's just like, well, you need to talk to Eric. Eric Bischoff is running it now. And I remember thinking, the AWA announcer? It was just like, it was almost that same moment that you had when you realized Vince McMahon, the WWF wrestling announcer, is actually the owner. Like Eric Bischoff is. But if you watch that, his Hall of Fame speech or any of his podcasts, he's a smart businessman. Like he truly is. Like he ran it like it was going to be a worldwide television product, not a regional wrestling show, and it wasn't just like the Jason Hervey connection that he had, the tie in there. Like you can tell he's just like, let's bring in the wrestlers from Japan. Let's bring in wrestlers from Mexico. Let's make this look a little bit real. It got really, he skewed towards real.
yeah.
And that's when wrestling is at its best, because look, we have to suspend our belief. I say that all the time on here. We have to suspend our belief. And it's easier to suspend our belief when you start skewing towards real. And that's when he hit, it was real enough that when he stole Hulk Hogan and go there, but Hogan still came over and was cartoon Hogan.
Right.
Right.
He was a Hulkster.
Yeah.
Instead of Hulkmania.
Yeah, exactly.
Copyrighted by WWF.
Exactly. And Marvel. But like he still came in as that. So it wasn't working, but he was trying all this stuff. And then it was just like, he's just like, I signed Scott Hall, Razor Ramon. And then to me, it was just like, okay, this is what we're going to do. He started breaking the rules. Rules are meant to be broken. It's just like, you're going to be Scott Hall, come in through the audience. We're never going to call you by name. But just by the way he acted, it made it look like WWF was invading, WCW.
Yeah.
And they hinted to that. And they never said it. And he let perception be your reality. It skewed towards real. I remember popping big, and I was even in the business at the time. And I was like, holy shit, what are they doing? It's like, what's happening right now? And then Kevin Nash comes, and everybody knew that the Clique were really good friends. They just had the curtain call. So you knew he was leaving, but you didn't know he was going to show up. And
Did you see that first episode live when Scott Hall came
Absolutely.
over? You were watching that?
Oh yeah, I was watching it live. Well, I watched it. I watched it at my tag team partner's house. Like, remember us watching it, and I had missed a little bit of it, and he was taping it on VHS, and like he called me and he's like, "You have to see this. Hold on, I'm going to rewind it." So we waited for his rewind. I was like, what's going to happen? And I remember, and it was just like, holy shit, what is happening here? And it just worked. And it just like, it skewed towards real. They're just like, wow, he just stole these guys away. And then he started doing stuff like, giving away their, since WW Raw wasn't live anymore. It was live for a while when they first started. They were doing a very ECW style show,
right.
The small at the Hammerstein, one of the ballrooms, and they was live. But then they started traveling again, and then it was just like, then they went back to that old habit, right? That old, just like, well, let's just tape 3 weeks worth of TV here. And they started going back to that. But now the difference is the internet was still young, but it was easy enough to get actually results. So they started reading results. Don't change the channel. This is what's going to happen.
Yeah.
And that was big. Just like, oh, wow. So, I mean, that was like a legit war. It's just like, wow, this guy's like legit trying to like ruin, trying to put WD out of business.
Right.
Trying to put them
and they were vulnerable at that time.
They were very vulnerable.
They were not the global empire they are now.
They weren't.
They were struggling to find an identity. They still had all the cartoony gimmicks from the 80s coming out.
They did.
It's whatever odd job you could think of.
Oh yeah,
making a gimmick.
The plumber, and they had the one of the guys from Dallas came in. He was the goon. He was a cowboy gimmick. Oh man, I can't believe I forget his name. I got hit in the head too much. But like he came and then he was like a hockey goon. It was just like, well, what is happening here? It's just like,
yeah.
But they forced them to like, this isn't going to work. You can't compete with that, and that kind of gave birth to that attitude error, which made them start winning the war back. And then they literally made it look like a war, right? It was just like once DX got hot, Stone Cold was hot, The Rock was getting hot. And then they had the DX show up at a WCW arena in a tank.
In the tank, yeah, I remember that.
Just like, and Eric Bischoff, one of his biggest regrets, he's like, why didn't we just let them in just to see what happens? This is live TV. He's like, I don't know why at the time I told him don't let him in. But thinking how I think now, we should have let him in. He said it would have been historical TV.
Yeah.
And it just like, it would have closed. Because even some of the wrestlers, like, man, at the time, WCW had Meng Haku, like one of the known toughest Samoans in the business that can beat up multiple guys at the same time. And him and the Barbarian, which I believe is his cousin, that probably could have just like destroyed most of the WWE locker room at the time. He's like, wait, we got these two like legit wrestling enforcers. Yeah, open the gate, see what happens. And then at the same time, it's just like Hunter and X-Pac and Razor and Diesel, they're best friends, so they weren't going to fight. They were all making money because of this, so they're smart businessmen. So it's like, yeah, why didn't you just open it just to see what happens?
Yeah.
But, well, we know what happens, right? It's just like later on, after that first war ended and WWF won the war, Shane showing up on Nitro and saying, now I now own WCW, even though they worked it into their gimmick, but they had the first simultaneous cast, right? You had one McMahon on, TNT and the other McMahon on WWE arguing with each other on the same show on both channels.
Yeah, that was big. It's funny. It makes me nostalgic for the old days of TV. Things were new. Like,
oh yeah.
If you think about it, reality TV had just started a couple years before that. So the idea that there was that you could, sort of like see things happening behind the scenes, or you were just like, people were aware of cameras now.
Right.
It was a new thing.
They're used to cameras now, but yeah, back then you weren't like having a lot of BTS, like even showing back to like a lot of BT stuff that you're not used to seeing. It looks unique. Mm-hmm. Where now you're used to seeing a lot of behind the scenes stuff. Any of the, like, they're always filming a documentary. This camera is always going. At the time, where that wasn't the case back then. Not everyone had a 4K camera in their pocket either, right?
Right.
So that made a big difference. But fast forward, right? That was a lot for the great wrestling World War I.
Yeah.
But now,
why do you think you don't have to do a whole documentary on it? But why did WCW lose?
Oh, they got spread too thin, and they stopped. They basically started signing guys just so WWF wouldn't sign them, and there wasn't enough. It was financial because of these big, huge contracts, and it was just everyone lost creative control. You didn't have one person running the show, so they didn't have one vision on where to go like they did in the beginning. Eric Bischoff should have stayed in that. It all goes through him. But then, like, Hogan had a say, Nash, everybody had too much of a say. And from what I'm told, it was like a really competitive environment. So it was like keeping people down. They had 50 members of the NWO instead of just like the core 3.
There was a lot.
Yeah.
They got whole NWO pay-per-views, I remember.
Yeah, sold out.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just like, that was the main reason. It's just like, it burned the candle at both ends, and they just ran out of gas. And at the same time, it's just like at WWF just had a better product. They had no choice but to make a better product. And I believe a big reason for that is ECW. They
absorbed ECW.
They did absorb ECW. They basically started. Here's a cool rumor. It's just like Vince McMahon was secretly funding ECW as like a let's say a very edgy, hardcore alpha version of what NXT is now. Paulie always had a great business relationship. He's always been a part of it. And I think that had a lot to do with it. He's like, well, crap, if we have to go edgy, let's do what Paul's doing. Because basically Heyman was doing, dude, it was just like, if you hear, that's a whole nother show of like hearing how they made those ECW shows in, Paul E's basement, with equipment that are just like that they scratched together, and he was using non-copyrighted. You know, he didn't have the copyright to this music, but it's just like when I hear the Pulp Fiction Miserlou song, I think of Pulp Fiction, but I also think of ECW.
What did he use that on? Was that on
One of his ECW shows? I was living up north at the time, and he had a show on MSG. On the Madison Square Garden Network, which is basically like, wow, this is like old school wrestling, and it felt like that. And it's just like he was making his basement. The matches were great because they were heavily edited. He cut the shit out of that stuff, and he made every wrestler he had over and make sense. He had no wasted movement on his shows, and it was so good and edgy. And Vince knew that, and he saw it and do it. And then eventually Vince started taking some of the guys and just like, okay, I'm going to take him now, but I'll give you him. Like Vince has always been great about like the talent swap. Like I won't leave you without. So it's just like, here, we just got, we're going to send this guy back to you. You can borrow him. You know, Jerry Lawler was known to hate ECW, but then he's like, okay, you can borrow him for your show, you know? So they started doing a talent swap, but then eventually they're just like, we just took it all in. But that ECW Edge, and then Mike Tyson, and then Stone Cold, and then The Rock and DX all hitting at the same time that nothing in WCW outside of like NWO and Goldberg was hitting. And that was starting to get watered down is the real reason like they lost. I think it was definitely death by 1,000 cuts and not just one thing that finished them off. But the fans won because it was great. It was great TV, and it forced it. And you know, it's just like, you know, you heard, you know, Mick Foley talking later on. It's just like Vince would get insulted when people like, man, you're just like, because the product started getting watered down again. Because and it's just like, you're just better when there's competition. And Vince would be like, get pissed when he hear that because what are you talking about? It's like he takes all these rivalries very personally.